talk about queerness and Jewishness, but to get me to stop. So this is for your protection, so we're not here for 3 hours. Okay. It's inevitable. Every time I get into conversation with someone about Judaism and queer identities, sooner or later, someone asks about that verse. You know, Leviticus 18:22. The one that's commonly translated as, "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman," is an abomination. That verse. So before we move on to talking about how Judaism informs queer identities and how queer identities inform Judaism, let's just address the elephant in the room directly, shall we? Everett Fox's translation of this particular verse, which is a thorny beast at best to even translate into the English language, reads, "With a male you are not to lie after the manner of lying with a woman. It is an abomination." It's the closest we can get to an actual English translation, because at least one of those Hebrew words is so old that we don't actually know for sure what it means anymore. So we're starting out at a deficit, and here many rabbis say we should just stop. If we can't say for certain that we know with absolute clarity what a verse means, we should just say, you know what, we're not sure. But even if we assume that we know exactly what the words are for that specific verse, we have to look at the verse in its given cultural and textual context. The first piece of important context is to remember the presence of the Romans and Greeks in the world around the Jewish people, and that institutionalized pederasty was part of their cultural norms. So this verse could very well simply be saying, hey, you know, it's not okay for adult men to participate in abusing boys. That could be it. Another possibility comes from Rabbi Rachel Barenblatt, who points out that Leviticus 18 begins, "What is done in the land of Egypt, wherein you were settled, you are not to do. What is done in the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you, you are not to do. By their laws, you are not to walk." That's also translated by Everett Fox. Ritual prostitution was part of Canaanite religious culture and part of Egyptian religious culture too. So it's arguable that Leviticus 18:22 refers to same-sex temple rituals. Rabbi Arthur Waskow, on the other hand, a lot of Jewish things go on the other hand several times, writes on religionstolerance.org, "Do not lie with a man as if it were the same thing as lying with a woman. That is, when two gay men have a sexual encounter, they should be continuously aware that it's different from a male-female coupling. It might be interpreted to mean set up a parallel set of institutions for dealing with this kind of sexual relationship that are different from those that apply to male-female sexual relationships." Further, he adds, "Do not sleep with a man as if it were with a woman," is another possible way to view this. That is, if two men engage in a sexual act, neither should pretend that the passive partner is like a woman. They should be fully aware of their sexual orientation and maleness and come out of the closet and acknowledge their gayness. So clearly, no matter how you look at it, there are a lot of ways that this can be read. This should not surprise anyone who's ever attended a Torah study or listened to Jewish people discuss pretty much anything. It's not for nothing that the saying goes, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. What's clear is that when placed in the context of the rest of Leviticus, where all of the prohibitions were about extremely specific behaviors common to Goyim, to the nations of the world which are not Jewish, and how Jews were to set themselves apart from those people, that these pieces of context really, really matter. And since we can't know for sure, is it really right for us to push our fellow Jews out of community by insisting that they're not right, that they aren't whole, that they are not as they are made, B'Tselem Elohim, made in the image of God? Look, I'm not going to represent to you that every rabbi in every movement in Judaism believes that the answer to that question is no, that we absolutely can't push our siblings out of community, and that quite the opposite, we should accept them fully. But I am going to say that as far as the Reform, Conservative, and Reconstructionist movements are concerned, queer individuals, including transgender and non-binary people, are expressly affirmed. And all synagogues in those movements will perform queer marriages. That verse, as my rabbi, Rabbi David Gerber, put it, is irrelevant to modern Reformed Jewish life. Whatever that verse initially meant, it clearly had nothing to do with and nothing to say about loving, committed relationships between queer adults, period. So, elephant shoot out of the room. Let's talk a little bit more about what it means to be queer and to be Jewish. Being queer and Jewish means knowing that two of the most unreservedly loving relationships in the Tanakh, David and Jonathan and Naomi and Ruth, are often seen by rabbis as same-sex relationships. The words that Ruth said to Naomi, beginning with, "Entreat me not to leave you," we use those for weddings. We've used those for weddings for centuries. We see in the words that one woman said to another woman, the words of a lifelong marital vow. So being queer and Jewish also means knowing that transgender and intersex people are not a modern invention, no matter what pundits and trans-exclusionary radical feminists say, and knowing that because our texts reflect our existence. Being queer and Jewish means knowing that 2,000 years ago, during the time of the Babylonian Talmud, Judaism recognized not 2, but 6 genders. This is one of my very favorite things that very, very few people who aren't Jewish know about. So we're going to pause here for a minute. We find references to 6 different genders in the Talmud. Zachar, a word derived from pointy sword, which translates to what we'd understand as a cisgender man. Nekeva, a word derived from crevice, which translates in context to what we'd understand today to be a cisgender woman. Androgynos, which comes from Greek, and refers to someone with both male and female sexual characteristics. So this likely refers to intersex or non-binary people, from what we can gather from context. Tum-tum, which I think is just a delightful word, a person whose sexual characteristics are indeterminate or obscured, which again likely refers to an intersex, non-binary, or agender person in today's parlance. Ilonit, a person who is identified as female at birth, but develops male sexual characteristics at puberty and is infertile, which might be someone with polycystic ovarian syndrome, or it might be an intersex person, or it might be what we would today refer to as a transgender man. And lastly, Saris, a person who is identified male at birth, but develops female characteristics at puberty. Someone may be Saris Chama, or Saris Adam, that is, one may be naturally Saris, or become Saris through human intervention. 2,000 years ago. So again, this may refer to an intersex person, or any number of other situations, but Saris Adam pretty clearly also fits what we now understand as a transgender woman. They even talk about human intervention as a means of changing gender. I can't say this enough, 2,000 years ago. Not just that's a broken dude, but that's someone who changed gender. Now, why do I love this so much? I mean, is it just that it's proof that right there that the rabbis knew 2,000 years ago that human gender was not so simple as 1, 0, on switch, off switch, man, woman? Well, yes, that's one of the reasons. I really love seeing evidence that the rabbis knew that. However, what's even more interesting to me is the context in which we find those words. The rabbis argue, as the rabbis will, for pages and pages and pages about how these genders interact with Jewish law. Until about 2 years ago, when the non-binary Hebrew project started to add gender-neutral options, Hebrew was a strictly binary language, and therefore halacha, Jewish law, was very, very binary. But humans don't adhere to the binary, so what the heck are we going to do with these people that don't fit the mold? Are we going to kick them out of the community? Are we going to tell them they're wrong to be who they are? Are we going to try to get them to adhere to that 1-0 gender binary? Heck no, say the rabbis. What we're going to do is argue endlessly about whether a tumtum inherits as a man or an Ilonit is responsible for marrying his brother's sister if his brother dies. There's never a question as to whether or not these Jews were Jews, or whether or not they were going to be included fully in community and in Jewish life. Clearly they belong in our community. The question is not if, but how. 2,000 years ago, Our rabbis understood that. And being queer and Jewish means knowing that I am seen, as I am, as a member of a community. B'Tselem Elohim, made in the image of God. Being queer and Jewish means never being satisfied with things as they are, and knowing that queerness is a discussion, just as Judaism is a discussion. Just as the language that we use to discuss our queerness is in constant discussion and upgrading and changing and tweaking, so Jewish queers are not satisfied with a binary language to discuss ourselves. And as I mentioned, the Non-Binary Hebrew Project has been working on adding a gender-neutral option to an extremely male-female on-off binary language. Being queer and Jewish means a lot of things, and not all of them are positive. It also means that in queer spaces I am often on guard, waiting for the anti-Semitism to leap out of the proverbial bushes at me. Queer spaces, which are not exclusively queer and Jewish spaces, often have an awful lot of unexamined anti-Semitism, most often masquerading as anti-Israel sentiment. And so being queer and Jewish often means being on the defense in the queer community. Being queer and Jewish also means I've got two strong communities that are often in conflict because of the unexamined anti-Semitism in leftist spaces and the homophobia and transphobia in Jewish spaces. People aren't perfect, of course, and in a lot of synagogue spaces I can find myself sliding back into the closet because it's easier just to not have the conversation about why I, as a person who is commonly perceived as a woman, still identify as queer when I'm visibly partnered with someone who people commonly perceive as a man. My spouse and I both are non-binary and use they, them pronouns. I mean, look, I love nothing better than talking about queer theory, but sometimes you don't want to grind the Seder to a halt because your host's bubby doesn't understand that identity doesn't change based on relationships, and that someone who's bi and looks like a woman entering into a relationship with a man doesn't make her suddenly straight. It's not the best way to get invited back. Sometimes it's easier just to sidle back into the closet for a couple hours. But being queer and Jewish also means that I have access to a discipline of thought through Judaism which makes me a better queer. Torah study prepares me for challenging and questioning the assumptions on which I have built my life, on taking apart, piece by piece, the self-hatred and accordant self-destructive behaviors fostered by growing up queer in a world hostile to core pieces of my being. Likewise, being queer makes me a better Jew. Having experienced well-meaning people's discrimination and exclusionary politics within queer spaces prepared me to advocate for our community to examine its deep-seated issues of racism that sometimes sees Jews of color, in particular Black Jews, asked if they're guests at synagogue or employees. The presumption of belonging is removed because of the level of melanin in their skin, as the presumption of belonging is removed in many straight places for trans people who do not pass as cisgender. So being queer prepares me to continually speak on that and on the difficulties faced by converts, who often experience subtle othering and lesser than status similar to the othering and lesser than status which, for example, bisexual women often experience in queer female spaces from lesbians. You're one of us, but not quite. Not quite. But when those two core parts of queer Jews, our queerness and our Jewishness, are married and celebrated together, we gather and worship as we do at the LGBTQ Seder hosted every year by Collegeville in Philadelphia. At this Seder, instead of calling out the 10 plagues visited upon Egypt, we call out the names of the trans people murdered since our last Seder, honoring their memory and understanding the plagues of homophobia, queerphobia, and transphobia which we face. And lest you think I exaggerate by calling them plagues. The other day, a queer person in their early 20s told me that I needed to get used to people looking up to me because I'm a middle-aged trans queer. And the very fact that I'm getting older when so many of us don't means that people will want to know what I know, what I've lived through, and will regard the simple fact of my age as inspiration. We experience homelessness, medical abuse, alcoholism, drug abuse, incarceration, and domestic abuse at much higher rates than our straight counterparts. Queerphobia is our plague. At that Seder, queer Jews drink our second glass of wine to an idea that speaks to both sides of ourselves, to the idea that we will find a safe place to grow and thrive. Our Haggadah, or order of service for the queer Seder, explicitly speaks about the shared and overlapping oppressions of our Jewish and queer selves, acknowledging that we are still fighting for our rights as queer Jews and queers to live and thrive. Where in a traditional Seder we say next year in Jerusalem, in our queer Seder we translate the idea behind that to one resonant for all Jewish queers everywhere, regardless of location or desire to make Aliyah to Israel. May we all be free to live in peace as our whole, complete self, in all spaces, sacred and mundane. And that, in the end, is what gives queer Jews the strength and focus to explain Leviticus 18:22 for the 18th time this week. The promise we make to each other, over and over, not just on Passover, but every day. Next year in Jerusalem. Next year, may we all be free.